The morning had all the trappings of a peaceful Saturday, nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was just starting to warm the neighborhood, casting a soft, golden light across the lawns. Birds chirped, and there was a gentle hum of life in the air. The kids were bustling with energy, eager to start the day, running around the yard, their laughter filling the air. It was the kind of Saturday you dream of, simple, carefree, and filled with the promise of family moments. Inside, I was busy making breakfast, the comforting smells of pancakes and bacon mixing with the sound of the kids playing outside. My wife stood by the window, her back to me, her smile lighting up the room as she watched the children. In that moment, everything seemed right in the world. We had been living in this neighborhood for years. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. A place where you could enjoy a quiet life, where the hustle of the outside world felt distant. But even in such a seemingly ideal setting, there was always a shadow, and that shadow was Karen, our neighbor, and, quite frankly, our nightmare. Over the years, she had gone from being a simple annoyance to a serious thorn in our side. What started as small complaints to the HOA about our yard being too messy, about the noise from our kids playing, had escalated into something much uglier. She seemed to take pleasure in making our lives difficult, turning the most mundane interactions into battles. At first, we thought it was just part of living in a neighborhood with strong opinions and regulations. But it soon became clear that Karen's attitude was more than just that of a picky neighbor, it was personal. We had tried to reason with her, to make peace, but it never worked. Karen wasn't interested in harmony. She wanted control. She wanted things done her way. And anyone who didn't fall in line was a target. Her complaints became more frequent, her demands more unreasonable. The HOA, once a neutral party, had started siding with her, further complicating things. I remember countless evenings spent on the phone with the board, trying to explain that we weren't breaking any rules, that we weren't in violation of anything. But Karen's influence over the community had grown stronger. It felt as though she was slowly chipping away at the peace we had once enjoyed, making us feel like outsiders in our own neighborhood. That Saturday morning was no different than any other at first. The kids were excited, and I was trying to focus on making breakfast, thinking about the errands I needed to run later in the day. But there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't shake. The HOA's recent decision to fine us for a minor infraction, one that had already been addressed, was still fresh in my mind. I knew it was Karen who had pushed for it. She was relentless in her crusade to make our lives difficult. My wife, ever the peacemaker, had been the one to speak with her most often, trying to keep things civil, trying to make things work. She had always believed that if you showed kindness, you could break down walls. But that day, it seemed as though those walls had become impenetrable. As the minutes ticked by, a sense of foreboding settled over me. It wasn't just the usual sense of irritation with Karen. It was something deeper, more unsettling. I could feel it in the way my wife looked out the window, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. It was as if she, too, sensed that something was about to change. But we never imagined it would change so drastically, so violently. The peace was shattered when we saw Karen storming across the yard. Her face, usually contorted with irritation, was now twisted with rage. She had something in her hand, something we couldn't quite make out from where we stood. My wife, always the one to try and de-escalate a situation, stepped toward the door, preparing to go out and speak with her. I knew she wanted to make things right, as she always did, but something in her demeanor told me that this time would be different. It was as though the storm that had been building for months was finally ready to break. The kids, oblivious to the tension that had been mounting, continued to play, their laughter echoing in the yard, unaware of the darkness that was about to descend upon us. My wife opened the door, stepping outside with that same warm, reassuring smile she always wore, ready to talk to Karen, to settle whatever this new issue was. But this time, there was no room for dialogue. Karen didn't come with complaints or accusations. She came with something far worse. As soon as she spoke, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. The words that followed were not what anyone could have prepared for, not even in our worst fears. "She deserves it," Karen spat, her voice dripping with malice. Before I could react, before I could stop her, Karen raised her hand, and the unthinkable happened. In an instant, everything changed. My world was ripped apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The kids froze. Their innocent joy vanished in the blink of an eye. My wife fell, and everything went silent. The sounds of a neighborhood, the birds, the wind, everything seemed to fade away, replaced only by the deafening roar of shock and horror. The life we had built together, the love we had fought for, was suddenly shattered in a way I couldn't comprehend. The unthinkable had happened, and nothing would ever be the same again. The world around me seemed to collapse in that moment. The bright sunshine that had bathed our home just moments earlier now felt suffocating, oppressive, as if the very air had been sucked out of the yard. Time slowed, the seconds stretching into what felt like eternity. My legs were frozen, unable to move as I watched my wife fall to the ground in front of me. Her body, once full of life, now lay motionless, her eyes closed as if she had fallen asleep. But this wasn't sleep. This was something far worse. This was a nightmare I couldn't wake from, a nightmare that had just begun. The children were screaming. My son, only 8 years old, was the first to run toward her, his small arms reaching out to her, as if his touch could bring her back. But no amount of love, no amount of desperate effort could change what had just happened. He knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, shaking her, calling her name, but there was no answer. The sound of his cries tore through my heart, a sound I had never imagined hearing in a million years. My daughter, barely 6, stood frozen at the edge of the yard, her hands clutching her stuffed animal tightly, her face pale with fear. She didn't understand what had just transpired. To her, it was like something out of a terrible dream, a dream she couldn't wake from. I wanted to run to them, to pull them close, to protect them from the horror they were witnessing, but I was rooted to the spot, my mind trying to comprehend the chaos unfolding before my eyes. Karen stood there, unmoved, her eyes locked onto mine, cold, unfeeling. There was no remorse in her expression, no sign of regret, only a chilling sense of satisfaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just stood there, holding the gun, her words still hanging in the air. She deserved it. Those words echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness like an endless drumbeat, growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand how a person could look into the eyes of another human being, someone they had known for years, and take their life without a second thought. What had my wife done to deserve this? What had she done to provoke such a monstrous act? But there was no answer. The questions swirled around me, each one more painful than the last. I wanted to scream, to shout at Karen, to demand answers, but my voice was lost in the shock. My heart pounded in my chest, a constant reminder that my wife was gone, that our lives had been irrevocably changed. I looked at her once more, lying there lifeless, and I felt as if the ground beneath me had cracked open, swallowing me whole. My mind struggled to process the situation. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. Everything that had once been familiar, everything that had once felt like home, was now tainted with grief and terror. The laughter of the children, the peaceful mornings, the warmth of our home, it all seemed like a distant memory, a time that would never return. I tried to call for help, my voice trembling as I fumbled for my phone. But my hands were shaking uncontrollably, my fingers unable to dial the number. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear the sirens in the distance, but they felt so far away, so insignificant compared to the enormity of what had just happened. Karen didn't move. She didn't flinch when the police arrived, when the paramedics rushed to my wife's side, trying in vain to revive her. There was no sign of guilt on her face, no recognition of the devastation she had caused. She was calm, detached, as if this was just another day in her twisted world. She didn't seem to care that a mother was gone, that children would grow up without the woman who had been their world. She didn't care that a family had been torn apart in an instant. The children were taken away, their cries echoing in my ears as I tried to stay with my wife, holding her hand, begging her to wake up, even though I knew it was pointless. I wanted to scream, to rage at the world, but there were no words strong enough to express the fury, the pain, the utter helplessness I felt. Karen was arrested, but the anger that simmered inside me was not something that could be quelled by a simple arrest. It was a fury that burned through my veins, a rage that threatened to consume me. How could this happen? How could a woman so filled with hate take everything from us? How could someone so cold, so indifferent to the suffering of others, walk away from this unscathed? I looked at my wife one last time before the paramedics covered her body with a sheet. I couldn't understand how this could be real. It didn't make sense. Everything about it felt wrong, unnatural. My world had just been ripped apart, and there was no way to piece it back together. As the police took Karen away, I stood there, lost in a fog of disbelief and grief. The morning that had started so peacefully was now a nightmare I couldn't escape from. The love of my life was gone, and all that was left was a gaping hole in my chest. The world outside had moved on, but I was frozen in place, unable to move forward. The future, once filled with promise and joy, now seemed empty and hollow, and there was no going back. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect after a sudden loss, but something far more chilling, the kind of silence where nothing makes sense and everything seems wrong. The children were still in shock, their innocent minds unable to grasp the horror they had just witnessed. My son, still kneeling beside my wife, had no words. He was too young to understand the finality of death, but he knew his mother wasn't coming back. His small hands trembled as he gently touched her, his face frozen in disbelief, as though waiting for her to wake up to laugh, to call his name. But she didn't move. My daughter stood further away, her little arms wrapped tightly around her stuffed bear, as if it could offer her any comfort at all. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, her wide, unblinking eyes fixed on her mother's lifeless body. She didn't understand what had happened, but she could feel the weight of it in her bones. The innocence of her childhood had been violently ripped away, leaving behind nothing but confusion and terror. I felt my heart break as I watched them, their faces pale and lost, their voices trembling as they tried to make sense of it. My son, unable to hold back his tears any longer, looked up at me with eyes full of fear and pain. "Dad, why is she sleeping like that? Why isn't she waking up?" His voice cracked with a raw vulnerability that I couldn't protect him from. How could I explain to him that his mother, the woman who had always been there to kiss his scraped knees and comfort him after nightmares, was never coming back? How could I answer his innocent question when the truth was too painful, too horrific for him to understand? I turned to my daughter, who had started to cry silently, her small body shaking in my arms. She whispered, "Mommy's gone, Daddy." Those words, simple and quiet, crushed me. How could she even begin to understand what had just happened? How could she know the depth of the loss she had just endured? I pulled them both close to me, wrapping my arms around them as tightly as I could. But the comfort I tried to give felt hollow. How could I offer solace when my own heart was in pieces? How could I protect them from the overwhelming grief that had taken over our home when I was drowning in it myself? There was no explanation that would make sense. There was no way to prepare them for the pain they were going to feel for the rest of their lives. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. The paramedics had already come and gone, their futile attempts to revive my wife now a distant memory. The police had arrived too, but none of that felt real. Nothing felt real. I was lost in a haze of emotions, grief, anger, helplessness, and all I could do was hold my children and pray that somehow, in some small way, they would be able to make it through this nightmare with me. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. The trauma they had just witnessed would stay with them, haunting them for years to come. How could it not? The image of their mother, shot in cold blood, was burned into their memories forever. They would never forget the moment their world was turned upside down, the moment that everything they had ever known was ripped apart. I wanted to scream, to demand justice for my wife, to make Karen pay for what she had done. But I couldn't. I had to stay strong for my children, for the memory of the woman who had given everything for our family. But as I looked at my son, his tear-streaked face and trembling hands, I felt my own resolve start to break. How could I protect them from the world when even something as simple as standing in the yard could turn into such a nightmare? The police tried to speak with the children to get their statements, but how could they answer when their minds were too clouded with fear and confusion? They couldn't. They wouldn't. Not yet. They needed time, and all I could do was hold them, shield them from the reality of what had happened. Even though I knew I couldn't protect them from the pain, I wanted to promise them that everything would be okay, that we would get through this, but deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be okay again. The woman they had loved, the woman who had been their mother, was gone, and the void she left behind would never be filled. I couldn't undo the past, couldn't change what had happened. All I could do was be there for them, be the father they needed, and hope that in time we would find a way to heal. But even that felt impossible. How could we heal from something so senseless, so cruel? How could we move on when our lives had been shattered in an instant? The pain was too much to bear, and as I looked at my children, I realized that we were no longer the family we once were. We were survivors, bound together by grief, by love, and by the memory of a woman who had given us everything. But we were broken, and there was no telling how long it would take to put the pieces back together. The days following the shooting blurred into a haze of grief and disbelief. The world outside our home carried on as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything was fractured. The pain of losing my wife in such a brutal, senseless way was a constant ache that gnawed at my soul. I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, I was reminded of the life we had built together, and now, without her, it felt like the world was slowly slipping through my fingers. The children, though still reeling from the shock, clung to me more than ever. Their eyes, once full of innocence and wonder, were now clouded with confusion and sorrow. My son had stopped asking questions about where Mommy was, and my daughter's bright smiles had faded, replaced by quiet tears that she didn't know how to shed. Their pain was a reflection of my own, and I wish more than anything that I could take it away, that I could somehow undo the nightmare that had consumed our lives. The funeral was a blur, a surreal experience where I had to watch my wife's body lowered into the ground, knowing she would never walk through the door again, never hug our children, never fill our home with her laughter and love. The air felt thick with grief, with the weight of so many questions, but none of them would ever be answered. Karen's cold, cruel words replayed in my mind. She deserved it. I couldn't fathom how someone could say such a thing about another human being. What had my wife done to deserve this? She had been nothing but kind, nothing but loving, and yet she had been taken from us in the most horrific way. In the days that followed, there was an outpouring of support from our neighbors and friends, but it all felt hollow. People sent flowers, made phone calls, offered their condolences, but none of it could fill the empty space my wife had left behind. No amount of sympathy could bring her back. The well-meaning words didn't ease the pain. They only served to remind me of the hole that had opened up in our lives. The police investigation, though thorough, offered no real comfort. They had arrested Karen, of course, but the damage had already been done. Her arrest did little to bring back my wife. The evidence against her was undeniable: the gun, the witness statements, the cold, calculated malice in her actions. But there was no sense of closure. The justice system would do its part, but no sentence could ever be enough to heal the wound that had been inflicted on our family. No amount of time served in prison would bring back the woman I had loved, the mother of my children, the woman who had been the heart of our home. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself struggling to hold it together. The children needed me, but I didn't know how to be the strong, supportive father they needed. I was broken, lost in my grief, unsure of how to move forward. Every day was a battle to get out of bed, a battle to put on a brave face for my kids, a battle to live in a world where my wife no longer existed. I couldn't escape the images that haunted me, the image of her lying in the yard, her life slipping away in front of our children. I couldn't escape the sound of her name on Karen's lips, the chilling indifference in her voice as she said, "She deserved it." The anger I felt toward Karen was consuming. It boiled inside me, threatening to erupt at any moment. How could someone be so cold, so heartless? How could someone who had lived on the same street, shared conversations over the fence, and witnessed our lives, so easily take a life away? I knew that Karen had been a source of stress for us, but nothing could have prepared me for the violence that erupted that day. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The trial, when it eventually came, felt like another chapter in an endless nightmare. The courtroom was filled with the hushed whispers of onlookers, all eager to see what would happen to Karen, but I wasn't interested in her fate. I didn't care about the legal proceedings, the arguments, the technicalities. All I cared about was the woman who had been ripped from my life, the woman who would never walk through the door again, never laugh with me over a cup of coffee, never hold our children in her arms. As the prosecutor spoke, as the evidence was presented, I couldn't help but feel numb. I was there, but I wasn't. The details, the witness testimony, the facts, they all seemed so irrelevant in the face of the overwhelming truth. My wife was gone. Nothing anyone said, nothing anyone did could ever change that. The children, too, were processing the trauma in their own ways. My son, once so outgoing, became withdrawn, unwilling to speak about what had happened. My daughter, though young, began to show signs of fear and anxiety, unable to sleep without me by her side, scared of the world around her. I watched them both suffer in silence, and I knew that they, too, would carry the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. Even as I tried to focus on the trial, on the quest for justice, I couldn't help but feel that it was all in vain. Justice was a concept that could never undo the damage that had been done. Even if Karen was convicted and sent to prison, nothing would bring my wife back. No punishment would ever make up for the loss we had suffered. The only thing left was the hole she had left in our hearts, a hole that no amount of time or legal proceedings could ever fill. I wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, but instead I swallowed my anger, my grief, and tried to keep moving forward. For the children, for my wife, for the memory of the love we had once shared. But even as I took each step, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And as I looked at the faces of my children, I realized that we were no longer just a family grieving a loss. We were survivors of a tragedy that had stolen our peace and left us with nothing but the bitter taste of revenge and sorrow. The investigation that followed was both a necessary step toward justice and an overwhelming reminder of everything we had lost. The police arrived quickly after the shooting, as if they had been expecting something like this to happen. But it felt like the world had slowed down when they entered our yard. The calm, everyday world we once knew was now a crime scene, and I couldn't escape the fact that the love of my life was gone. The initial shock had worn off, but the cold reality of it all was still too much to handle. The officers began their questioning, speaking with me, the children, the neighbors, and Karen herself. There was little to say. The facts were clear. Karen had shot my wife in cold blood in front of our children, and nothing could change that. But as the weeks passed, I began to realize how much more this investigation would drag on, how much more painful it would become. The grief I felt was now compounded by the frustration of the never-ending legal processes. The questions felt invasive. The long hours of waiting for updates from the detectives were agonizing. But more than anything, it was the realization that we had to live with the memory of this day for the rest of our lives. The police were diligent, following every lead, but what could they truly uncover about Karen's motives? How could they explain why someone would do something so monstrous, so unprovoked? As the investigation deepened, the pieces of Karen's past began to surface, the complaints, the legal disputes, her reputation as a troublemaker in the neighborhood. She had a history of conflict with everyone around her, But there was no explanation for her extreme actions that day. There was no sign that she was capable of such violence, at least not in the way she'd shown it. I learned that Karen had been obsessed with control. She had often tried to get others to fall in line with her, whether it was about the appearance of the neighborhood or how the HOA was run. Her hatred for those who didn't conform, like our family, had been building for years. My wife had always been the one to try to keep things peaceful, to diffuse the tension between Karen and the other neighbors, but that had never been enough. The tension between Karen and us had been palpable, but it had always been just beneath the surface. That is, until it exploded. Karen had even gone as far as to involve the HOA board, trying to get us fined for minor issues with our property, filing complaints for trivial things that didn't matter. At first, we thought it was just her being difficult, but after a while, it became clear that her behavior was escalating. I had no idea how deep her resentment ran, how far she was willing to go to punish those she considered her enemies. But now I saw it, her need for control, her desire to dominate, to punish. I saw it in her actions that day, in the way she shot my wife without hesitation, without remorse. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that Karen was not the remorseful person I had hoped she might be. She didn't seem sorry for what she had done. She didn't seem to understand the gravity of her actions. In fact, she barely seemed to care. She remained cold, detached, and when questioned, her answers were mechanical, as if she had rehearsed them. She deserved it, she had said over and over again. Each time, the words cut deeper, as if Karen had justified this violent act in her own mind. But no matter how much I tried to understand her reasoning, it didn't make sense. My wife had done nothing wrong. She had only tried to make peace with Karen, to be the bigger person. Yet, somehow, Karen had convinced herself that my wife's kindness was a weakness, something to be exploited. The investigation soon turned into a public spectacle, with reporters showing up at our doorstep, cameras flashing in our faces, trying to capture every painful moment of our grief. I wanted to shout at them, to demand they leave us alone, but there was nothing I could do. We had become part of a story, part of something larger than ourselves, but it didn't feel like our pain was being acknowledged. It was as if we were just another headline, another case to be solved. The humanity of the situation, the personal cost of this loss, seemed lost in the noise of the media circus. The children, thankfully, were sheltered for most of it. We kept them away from the cameras, kept them from hearing the reporters' questions, their prying eyes, but the damage had already been done. The trauma they had experienced would stay with them forever. How could not? They had seen their mother shot before their eyes, her life taken in an instant, and there was no undoing that. There was no way to make it right. I began to feel like I was drowning in the legal process, in the constant interviews, the never-ending paperwork, and the lawyers' meetings. Everyone wanted a statement from me, everyone had questions, but no one had answers. No one could bring my wife back. No one could undo the horror that had been done. The frustration of it all built inside me, a pressure that I couldn't release. Every time I spoke to the police, every time I sat through another round of questioning, I was reminded of what had been taken from me. But there were moments when I allowed myself to feel the anger, the pure, unfiltered rage that burned deep inside me. I couldn't stand the thought of Karen walking free, of her being allowed to go on with her life, when she had so callously destroyed mine. She had taken my wife, the heart of our family, and for what? A petty vendetta? A need for control? It didn't matter. It was senseless. And as much as the investigation brought some answers, it didn't bring peace. It didn't bring closure. The only thing that could have done that was having her back, but that was impossible. The more I learned about Karen's history, the more I realized how much I had underestimated her. What we had thought were mere annoyances were symptoms of something far darker. And as the investigation unfolded, I couldn't help but think that maybe this was all part of a bigger pattern, a cycle of control, manipulation, and violence that had been building for years. And in the end, it had taken my wife's life to reveal it. Now, I was left to pick up the pieces. And as I looked at my children, their faces filled with sadness and fear, I knew that the journey ahead would be a long one. The road to justice, the road to healing would be long, painful, and uncertain. But I had no choice. I had to keep going. For them, for my wife, for the memory of the woman who had meant everything to me. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I found myself facing a truth I couldn't escape. My life, the life I had built with my wife, had been irrevocably shattered. The pain was so deep, so raw, that sometimes it felt like I was suffocating in it. The world around me seemed to carry on, as if nothing had happened, but every step I took felt like I was walking through a fog. Every moment of every day was a reminder of the void that had been left in our home, in our hearts. I tried to be strong for the children, but I didn't know how to do it anymore. There were days when I couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of grief was too much to bear. I had to force myself to take care of the kids, to help them with their schoolwork, to get them ready for bed at night. But even when I was physically present, I wasn't truly there. My mind was consumed with the horror of that day, replaying the moment over and over again. Karen's cold, emotionless face, the gunshot ringing in my ears, the sight of my wife falling to the ground, lifeless. How could I live with that? How could I carry on knowing that she was gone, that I would never again hear her voice or feel her touch? The truth that I had to live with was that my wife, the woman who had stood beside me through everything, was never coming back. And no amount of time or therapy would ever change that. The kids were struggling too. They were both too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had happened, but they felt the loss in ways they couldn't express. My son had become more withdrawn, spending long hours in his room, unable to talk about what he had seen, unable to put his feelings into words. My daughter, though younger, had begun to exhibit signs of anxiety, unable to sleep without me by her side, clinging to me in a way that made my heart ache. She missed her mother, and there was nothing I could do to fill the void she had left. No matter how many hugs I gave her, no matter how many times I told her everything would be okay, I knew it wasn't true. It would never be okay again. The emotional weight of it all was suffocating. There were times when I found myself simply staring at the wall, unable to move or think. Everything felt like an effort. The simple tasks of daily life, making breakfast, doing the laundry, picking up groceries, all felt like monumental chores. I had no energy, no motivation, and no hope. The grief had taken over every part of my life, and I didn't know how to get out from under it. I tried to keep up appearances. I went to the therapy sessions, I took the children to their counseling appointments, but inside, I was falling apart. There was no guidebook for how to navigate this kind of loss, no instructions on how to live with the knowledge that your spouse, your partner, the one person you trusted above all others, was gone. And then there were the nights. The nights were the hardest. When the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I would find myself alone with my thoughts. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how it had come to this. How had a woman who had been so kind, so full of life, been taken from us in such a brutal, senseless way? What had she done to deserve this? What had we done? Karen's words still echoed in my mind. She deserved it. How could anyone believe that? How could anyone justify taking the life of another human being, especially someone like my wife, who had only ever tried to do good? But in the silence of those late nights, I began to wonder if Karen had believed that so deeply that it had consumed her. Was she really so lost in her bitterness, her hatred, that she felt justified in ending a life? I didn't know the answer, and I didn't know if I would ever find peace. The anger I felt toward Karen was overwhelming. I hated her. I hated her for what she had done, for what she had taken from me, from my children. I wanted justice. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done, but even that didn't feel like enough. There was no punishment that could make up for the loss of my wife. There was no sentence that could bring her back. In the midst of all this turmoil, I started to question myself. Was I doing enough for the kids? Was I helping them cope with the trauma they had witnessed? Was I being the father they needed, or was I so consumed by my own pain that I was neglecting their needs? The guilt was suffocating, and the questions I couldn't answer only made things worse. I would watch the children as they played, as they tried to move on with their lives, and I would wonder if they would ever truly be okay. They would never forget what they had seen. They would never forget the terror, the confusion, the feeling of helplessness that had overwhelmed them that day. And I couldn't help but wonder if they would carry that pain with them for the rest of their lives. As much as I tried to push forward, I couldn't escape the truth. The truth that my life would never be the same. The truth that my children's lives would never be the same. The truth that the woman I had loved, the woman who had been my partner, my best friend, was gone, and there was nothing anyone could do to bring her back. In the face of this truth, I began to realize something. Grief wasn't just about mourning the loss of a person. It was about facing the fact that the world had changed, that nothing would ever be the same again. And learning to live with that truth, no matter how painful, would be the hardest thing I would ever have to do. But for the sake of my children, for the memory of my wife, I had no choice. I had to keep going, even if I didn't know how, even if I didn't know what the future held. The truth was that I had no answers. I had no resolution, but I had to keep fighting. For them, for us, for the love we once shared. The days dragged on, weighed down by the slow grind of the justice system. There were moments when I wondered if anything would ever feel right again, if I would ever find peace. But as much as I ached for closure, there was a burning need inside me to make sure Karen faced the consequences for what she had done. My wife's death couldn't just be another headline in the news. It couldn't just be a tragic event that was quickly forgotten. The pain we were going through needed to be acknowledged, and Karen needed to pay for what she had stolen from us, the love of a wife, a mother, a partner. I tried to keep myself focused on the trial. It wasn't easy. Every step of the process felt like another blow to my soul. The courtroom, the witnesses, the attorneys, they all felt like a blur. There were days when I couldn't even summon the strength to attend, when I just wanted to curl up in bed and never face the world again. But I knew I couldn't do that. I had to fight for my wife's memory. I had to make sure that her life meant something, even if it had been taken so senselessly. The courtroom battles were long and grueling. Karen's defense team worked tirelessly to paint her as a victim, to justify her actions as some sort of retaliation for perceived slights. They tried to argue that she had been pushed to the brink, that her actions, though extreme, were a result of the constant frustration she felt from the neighborhood and the HOA. They tried to turn her into the tragic figure, the woman who had been wronged and pushed into a corner. But I saw through it. I knew the truth. Karen was not the victim. My wife was. What struck me the most during the trial was Karen's complete lack of remorse. Every time she took the stand, every time she spoke, there was no hint of regret in her words. She showed no sorrow for what she had done. She didn't seem to care that she had destroyed a family, that she had torn apart the lives of two innocent children. All she cared about was defending herself, justifying her actions, and trying to convince everyone that she had been in the right. It was in those moments that the rage inside me grew. How could she be so cold? How could someone look at the devastation they had caused and not feel a shred of guilt? I wanted to stand up in that courtroom, to scream at her, to demand that she face the truth of what she had done. But I stayed silent. I had to. I couldn't let her drag me into the same pit of bitterness and hatred that she had obviously dug for herself. Instead, I focused on the children. I had to be strong for them. The thought of them growing up without their mother, of them carrying the weight of this tragedy for the rest of their lives, pushed me to keep going. Every time I looked at their innocent faces, I reminded myself that I had to keep fighting, not just for my wife's memory, but for them. As the trial progressed, I watched as the evidence mounted against Karen. The bullet, the forensic reports, the witness testimonies, everything pointed to her guilt. There was no question that she had taken my wife's life. But even as the case against her strengthened, the hollow feeling inside me remained. What would a guilty verdict really mean? Would it bring my wife back? Would it erase the pain of the last few months? I began to realize that the pursuit of justice, while necessary, would never bring the closure I desperately needed. Even if Karen was convicted, even if she was sentenced to prison, it wouldn't change the fact that my wife was gone. It wouldn't bring back the moments we had lost, the life we had planned together. It wouldn't undo the trauma my children had experienced. And yet I had to do it. I had to fight for justice because that was the only thing I could do for her now. The only thing I could do to honor her memory was to make sure that Karen faced the consequences of her actions. The trial eventually came to an end. The jury deliberated for hours, and when the verdict was read, I held my breath. The words guilty rang out in the courtroom. But even as I heard them, I felt nothing. The pain, the loss, the hole in my heart, it was still there. The justice we had fought for felt insufficient in the face of the unimaginable tragedy we had endured. Karen was sentenced to life in prison, but the words felt empty. Life in prison wouldn't bring my wife back. It wouldn't heal the wounds she had left behind. The gaping hole in our family would never be filled, no matter how long Karen served behind bars. The courtroom went silent as the judge passed sentence, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But despite the emptiness I felt, I knew that this chapter was coming to a close. I had fought for my wife's memory. I had fought for my children's future. And while the outcome didn't bring me peace, it gave me something, a small sense of justice. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of the next chapter. The trial was over, but our journey had just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with grief, with challenges, and with moments of doubt. But as I looked at my children, I knew that we would keep going. We would keep fighting for healing, for strength, for each other, for my wife, for the woman who had given us everything and who had been taken from us far too soon. We would carry her memory with us, always, and that, I realized, was the only true justice we would ever find. The verdict was delivered, and the final chapter in the courtroom drama came to a close. The justice system had done its part, but it felt like nothing more than an echo of what we truly needed. The life sentence Karen received didn't bring my wife back. It didn't erase the scars that had been left on our family, the mental and emotional wounds that would never truly heal. It didn't bring peace because peace was something that had been stolen from us on that horrific day. As I stood in the courtroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that the life I once knew was gone and there was no returning to it. My family would never be the same. My children would never have their mother again. And though we would go on, though we would try to live, to heal, a piece of us had been ripped away and would never be restored. When I left the courthouse, I was numb. I had hoped that somehow, some way, the conviction would fill the void, give me some kind of closure. But there was nothing. I looked at the children, who had been so brave throughout the entire process, but their faces told a story of pain I could never fully understand. They had been through so much already, and I knew that this trial, this verdict, this so-called justice, would be something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. We returned to the house, to the home that once was a place of laughter, of comfort, of love. But now it was filled with silence. The rooms felt empty, the air heavy with the memories of the woman who had been the heart of our family. There was no more warmth in the kitchen, no more soft words of reassurance, no more calls of, "I love you" at the end of the day. It was just an empty space, an echo of what used to be. The children tried to adjust in their own ways. My son began to retreat more, locking himself in his room, throwing himself into his schoolwork in an attempt to escape the painful reality of his loss. My daughter, though only 6, seemed to understand the weight of what had happened. She started clinging to me even more, unable to sleep without me beside her. The nightmares would come, and there was nothing I could do to make them go away. How could I? I was just as lost as they were, just as broken. As much as I tried to be strong for them, I knew I was failing. I wasn't strong enough to erase their pain, and I certainly wasn't strong enough to erase my own. But I also knew that I had no choice but to keep going. For their sake, for my wife's memory, I had to find a way to rebuild, to try to create something that resembled a future for my children, even if I didn't know how. We began attending therapy, each of us in our own sessions, trying to deal with the trauma we had experienced. But as I sat there, talking to the counselor, it became painfully clear that no amount of therapy would ever be enough. How do you heal from the loss of someone so vital, so irreplaceable? How do you move forward when the very foundation of your world has been torn apart? I would sometimes catch myself staring at the empty space where my wife's things used to be: her favorite books, her clothes, the jewelry she wore every day. Each item felt like a memory I would never get back, each one a reminder of what had been stolen from me. It was like I was living in the past, constantly trying to hold on to pieces of her, even though I knew she was gone. The more I clung to those memories, the more the pain intensified. But despite all the pain, despite the overwhelming grief that threatened to suffocate us, I realized something. We had each other. My children and I were all we had left, and we had to learn to survive in this new world without the person who had been our anchor. We weren't just victims of what had happened, we were survivors. And that, however small it seemed in the face of our loss, was something worth holding on to. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when I would feel like I couldn't breathe, when the weight of the loss would feel like too much. But there would also be days when the children would smile, when they would laugh, when they would show me a glimmer of hope. And in those moments, I knew we could rebuild. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but we could rebuild. We would honor my wife's memory by living our lives, by making sure her love never left us. The pain of losing her would never go away, that much was certain. But the love we had for her, the lessons she had taught us, the joy she had brought into our lives, would stay with us forever. And as we moved forward, step by step, I began to realize that my wife's legacy wasn't just in the moments we had shared. It was in the way we moved forward, in the way we learned to live without her. It was in the strength we found in each other, even in the darkest moments. We would never be the same. We could never go back to what we had before. But we would keep going for her, for the children, for the life we had shared. And in that, there was something worth fighting for.